It was a sweltering Tuesday afternoon and the courtroom in Washington, D.C. was buzzing with anticipation. Karoline Leavitt, the White House press secretary, had been summoned to court to testify in a legal case that had attracted national attention. The case had to do with a controversial executive order, one that had sparked fierce debate across the country. The opposing legal team was determined to tear into her credibility, hoping to undermine the administration's stance on the matter. Karoline sat at the witness stand, her composure as unshaken as ever. Dressed in a sharp navy blue suit, her hair perfectly styled, she exuded a calm yet undeniable aura of authority. As the attorney for the opposing side launched into his questions, she responded with clarity, each word measured and firm. But her opponent, a seasoned attorney known for his cutthroat tactics, had something far worse planned for her. He wasn't just interested in the case. He wanted to undermine her personally. The judge overseeing the case, Judge Warren Hayes, had been known for his hardline approach to legal matters. But he had a reputation for being a staunch ally of the political left. Though his biases were often subtle, they were not lost on anyone in the room. His disdain for the current administration was no secret, and it had earned him the nickname the liberal judge among those who followed his rulings. His record of questionable decisions had raised eyebrows on more than one occasion, but nothing had quite prepared Karoline for the way he would treat her. As the opposing lawyer pounded his case with sharp, invasive questions, Judge Hayes allowed the interrogation to continue unchecked, his eyes cold and unyielding. Karoline had always known that her position as press secretary would put her in the crosshairs, but she was unprepared for what happened next. Ms. Leavitt, the attorney began, his voice dripping with disdain. You've spent your career spinning lies to the public, have you not? You're just a puppet repeating whatever nonsense the administration tells you to say. How do you live with yourself, knowing you're part of this farce? The room fell silent. It was a low blow, one designed not just to discredit her but to break her spirit. But Karoline stood tall, her gaze unwavering. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could utter a word, Judge Hayes, who had remained unusually silent up to this point, spoke. Objection. Judge Hayes barked, his voice echoing through the courtroom. This line of questioning is irrelevant and inappropriate. Counsel, refrain from personal attacks. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the judge had come to her defense. But then, just as quickly, he turned his eyes back to Karoline. Ms. Leavitt, he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm, perhaps you can enlighten us. Do you believe the American people are stupid enough to fall for the nonsense you're peddling every day from that podium? Or are you just following orders from a man who knows nothing about the truth? The insult was blatant and the courtroom seemed to collectively gasp. Karoline's heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to let the judge see her flinch. She had faced far worse on the public stage and had never backed down. But in that moment, she knew that this battle would not be fought with words alone. The courtroom's tension was palpable as Judge Hayes's words hung in the air like a heavy cloud ready to burst. Karoline's hands gripped the edges of the witness stand, her knuckles turning white. The room was silent, every eye on her, waiting for a reaction. The attorney who had questioned her stood frozen, his smirk faltering as he tried to process what had just happened. Karoline had faced public scrutiny, ridicule, and worse in her time as press secretary. But this felt different. This was not just an attack on her political beliefs or her role in the administration, it was an attack on her character, her integrity, and her very humanity. She had been insulted in a court of law by the very person who was meant to uphold justice. And in that instant, Karoline realized that this was no longer about the case at hand. It was about standing her ground no matter the consequences. But what happened next, no one could have predicted. Your Honor, I respectfully object, Karoline said, her voice steady but filled with quiet fury. She looked directly at Judge Hayes, her gaze unwavering. You may be the judge of this court, but I will not allow you to insult me or anyone else in this room under the guise of legal proceedings. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Gasps echoed from the onlookers and the courtroom stenographer's fingers paused over the keys. The defense attorney blinked, clearly stunned that Karoline, someone so poised, would dare challenge the judge directly. But what really sent shockwaves through the room was the way Karoline had spoken, with a fire that was as sharp as it was controlled. She was no longer the victim in this story, she had just become the force that would turn the tables. Judge Hayes's face turned a deep shade of red, his lips thinning in rage. He slammed his gavel onto the podium, signaling for order, but the damage had already been done. The courtroom was no longer on his side. Ms. Leavitt, you will show respect in my courtroom, he growled, his voice trembling with indignation. How dare you address me in such a manner? I will hold you in contempt. But Karoline didn't flinch. She wasn't backing down. Contempt? For defending myself? For standing up to a corrupt system, she replied, her voice calm, but there was an edge to it, one that cut through the tension like a hot knife through butter. You want to punish me for standing up to your insults, for your biased rulings? You want to make an example out of me because I dare to challenge you? Well, Your Honor, you have misjudged me. And you have just made a grave mistake. The room was in shock. Karoline had just defied the very person who was meant to keep order, the person who was supposed to maintain the law. There were whispers, some supportive, some confused, but all of them punctuated by a sense that the balance of power in this courtroom had shifted. Judge Hayes, clearly furious, shot to his feet, his gavel raised high. Bailiff, he bellowed, his voice full of authority. Take this woman into custody immediately for contempt of court. She will be held responsible for her insubordination. The bailiff, a tall and broad-shouldered man, approached Karoline, his hand hovering near his cuffs. But before he could make a move, something even more unexpected happened. Karoline stood up, facing the judge directly. I will not be intimidated by you, Judge Hayes. You may hold the title of judge, but you do not have the right to disrespect me or anyone else in this room. The truth is, you're corrupt, and this courtroom is nothing more than a theater for your personal vendetta. Her words rang out, and for a moment, the room was silent. Everyone waited, unsure of how the judge would respond to this direct challenge. But then something happened that no one saw coming. As Karoline's words echoed through the courtroom, the tension in the air became suffocating. It was as if time itself had come to a standstill. Judge Hayes's face twisted into a mask of fury, but beneath it there was a flicker of something else, something darker, more desperate. He glared at Karoline as if he were staring down a threat to his entire existence. In that moment it was clear, he was losing control. Enough of this insolence! Judge Hayes shouted, his voice breaking with uncharacteristic fear. He raised his gavel again, but this time something strange happened. The bailiff, standing at attention, suddenly stepped back. His expression changed and he seemed unsure of his next move. The courtroom was silent except for the soft hum of tension that filled the air. Then the door to the courtroom swung open with a force that startled everyone inside. 2 federal agents, clad in black suits, entered the room. They were not the usual courthouse security, but something about their presence suggested they were here on official business that was far more serious than simply escorting someone out for contempt. Judge Hayes, you're under arrest, one of the agents announced, his voice cold and commanding. You have the right to remain silent. The entire room went still. The weight of the words hit like a thunderclap. Karoline blinked in disbelief, unable to fully comprehend what she had just heard. Was this some sort of sick joke? The judge, who had insulted her and tried to have her arrested, was now the one in handcuffs? On what charges? Hayes sputtered, his voice trembling as he stood frozen in place, his gavel still clenched tightly in his fist. The agent didn't flinch. Corruption, bribery, obstruction of justice, and abuse of power, he said, listing the charges with chilling precision. You're being taken into custody for your involvement in a scheme that goes far beyond this courtroom. Gasps erupted from the spectators. A few murmurs of disbelief rippled through the crowd, while others seemed to take a step back, unsure whether this was part of some theatrical stunt or if it was real. But the reality quickly settled in. The judge, the very man who had made his career out of holding others accountable, was now being led out in handcuffs. Why you can't do this? I am the judge here. Judge Hayes protested, his voice high-pitched, his hands trembling as the agents escorted him towards the exit. Not anymore, one of the agents replied coldly, his grip tightening on Hayes's arm. You're under investigation for the abuse of your position for personal gain. Your days on the bench are over, Judge. It was as if the entire courtroom had collectively held its breath, and now, as the truth spilled out, they exhaled in shock. The man who had wielded so much power, who had belittled Karoline and tried to humiliate her in front of the nation, was now being led out as a criminal. Karoline, still standing at the witness stand, felt a sense of both disbelief and satisfaction. It was surreal. The very person who had tried to discredit her was now facing the consequences of his own actions. The courtroom was no longer filled with the voice of an unjust authority figure, it was filled with the sounds of a system starting to correct itself. The federal agents moved Hayes to the door, but not before he shot one last look at Karoline, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and defeat. He had been the one to dismiss her with disdain, the one who thought he could get away with his biased treatment. Now he was the one in cuffs. Karoline, however, stood firm, her expression resolute. She had not just won a personal victory. This was bigger. It was a victory for justice, for standing up against the system and for ensuring that no one, no matter how powerful, was above the law. The room erupted into chaotic murmurs, but Karoline was already focused on the next step. As the agents escorted Judge Hayes out of the courtroom, she turned to the attorney who had been trying to undermine her, her gaze cold. "I'm ready to continue," she said, her voice steady, no longer even needing to prove herself to anyone. As the courtroom tried to regain its composure, the reality of the events that had just unfolded set in. People exchanged confused looks, some muttering among themselves while others sat in stunned silence. The courtroom, which had been an arena for hostility just moments ago, was now a place of confusion, disbelief, and a strange sense of anticipation. Judge Hayes, once a towering figure in the courtroom, was now nothing more than a criminal being carted away. His removal was an unexpected twist in a legal drama that few could have predicted, and it was clear that Karoline's role in that moment was nothing short of revolutionary. The defense attorney, who had been attempting to use Karoline as a punching bag, was speechless. He stood there, his face flushed with disbelief, unable to process the gravity of what had just happened. He had been poised to make his next strike against Karoline, but instead, the rug had been pulled out from under him and he had been left in the dust. Karoline, however, remained calm. Her expression was composed, though her mind was racing. The events of the last few minutes had thrown the case into complete disarray. Judge Hayes had been the very heart of the opposition's case, and his removal left a massive power vacuum. The prosecution team, who had been struggling with their case, now found themselves in an unusual position. They had not anticipated the collapse of the judge's credibility, let alone his arrest in real time. Karoline took a deep breath and adjusted her posture. She knew she couldn't allow herself to be distracted by the drama unfolding. The case was still ongoing, and there was still work to be done. "Your Honor," Karoline began, but before she could finish her sentence, the courtroom door swung open once again. A new judge entered the room. This one was different, composed, authoritative, and confident. His arrival felt almost surreal, as if the tide of justice had turned in an instant. He was tall, dressed in a sharp black robe, and carried himself with the kind of confidence that was both reassuring and intimidating. The new judge, Judge Edward Caldwell, looked around the room, taking in the scene. The agents were still escorting Hayes out, and the entire courtroom seemed to be in a state of flux. His eyes met Karoline's for a brief moment before he spoke. "I apologize for the disruption," Judge Caldwell said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of authority. "It seems we have found ourselves in an unprecedented situation. However, the law must continue, and we shall proceed with the case. Ms. Leavitt, I trust you are ready to continue." Karoline nodded, her mind quickly shifting from the events of the last few minutes back to the matter at hand. She was ready. She had come here to do her job, to represent the truth, and she wasn't going to let anything stop her now, not even the shocking turn of events. "Thank you, Your Honor," she replied, her voice strong, unwavering. Judge Caldwell nodded, and with a brief look at the defense, he called for the continuation of the case. The new judge's entrance had completely changed the atmosphere in the room. There was no more animosity, no more sarcastic jabs aimed at Karoline. The focus had shifted, and even the opposing counsel seemed to take a step back, realizing that their attack on Karoline had lost all its potency. Karoline sat up straighter, her eyes narrowing as she prepared herself for the next round of questioning. She was ready for whatever came next. The corrupt judge was gone, and now it was time to take back control of the narrative. The White House had appointed her to do a job, and she was going to finish it no matter what. As the prosecution team began their questioning again, the energy in the courtroom was different. The pressure that had been so thick moments ago was gone. It was replaced by a quiet determination, a sense that justice was beginning to right the wrongs that had been allowed to fester for far too long. Judge Caldwell turned to Karoline, his tone respectful but firm. "Ms. Leavitt, let's proceed with your testimony. I believe you have much to offer the court." Karoline nodded. She was no longer just a press secretary defending the administration. She was a symbol of strength and resilience in the face of injustice. And as she prepared to speak, she knew one thing for certain: the tide had turned in her favor. As Karoline took the stand once again, her eyes moved over the faces of those present. The tension was still palpable, but now there was a quiet sense of victory in the air. The corrupt judge who had once held the power to manipulate the proceedings had been removed, and a sense of justice had settled in with the arrival of Judge Caldwell. The defense team, who had once been aggressive and confident, now looked uncertain. The opposing counsel shifted uneasily in his seat, unable to shake the weight of what had just transpired. The courtroom was no longer a space for their tactics of intimidation and manipulation. The events that had unfolded had turned the tide, and Karoline had emerged not as the victim but as the embodiment of justice. Judge Caldwell's presence was reassuring. Unlike Judge Hayes, who had used his position to exert power and make demeaning remarks, Judge Caldwell held a clear, unwavering commitment to the law. His demeanor was calm but firm. He had no time for distractions, no patience for the games that had been played earlier. Ms. Leavitt, Judge Caldwell began, his voice steady and commanding. I trust we can proceed without further interruptions. Please continue with your testimony. Karoline nodded, gathering her thoughts. She had already endured a great deal, insults, condescension, and an entire courtroom witnessing her being wrongfully attacked. But she was no longer the same person who had entered this room at the start of the day. The events had transformed her. What was once a difficult task had now become a mission to see justice done, to stand firm against the forces that sought to undermine her, and to ensure that those who believed they were untouchable would be held accountable. She cleared her throat and faced the opposing counsel. The prosecutor, who had remained neutral throughout the chaos, finally spoke. Ms. Leavitt, the prosecutor said, his voice more subdued than before, given the recent developments in this case, including the arrest of Judge Hayes, do you still stand by your statements and the evidence you've provided? Karoline's gaze was steady. The weight of the question hung in the air, but she had already made up her mind. Absolutely, she replied, her voice unwavering. I stand by everything I've said. The evidence is clear. The actions of Judge Hayes and others in this case are criminal, and they were not going to stop until the truth was revealed. I will not back down from the facts, no matter who tries to silence me. The defense attorney looked uncomfortable, his earlier swagger evaporating. And what exactly is it that you expect the court to do about this, Ms. Leavitt? Are you suggesting that the entire judicial system is corrupt, based on the actions of one judge? Karoline took a deep breath. She wasn't about to allow the defense to twist her words. I'm not suggesting the entire judicial system is corrupt, she replied firmly. But I am suggesting that there are those who abuse their power, who manipulate the system for their own gain. Judge Hayes was one of those individuals. And his actions were not just personal. They had a ripple effect on the lives of countless people. My job today is to ensure that this case is not tainted by corruption, and that the truth is allowed to stand. The defense lawyer opened his mouth to speak, but paused, clearly realizing he had no viable argument left. His earlier tactic of discrediting Karoline had completely backfired. She had risen above it all, standing tall and resolute in the face of adversity. Now, it was clear to everyone in the courtroom that the case had shifted in Karoline's favor. Judge Caldwell, who had been silently listening, nodded in approval. Thank you, Ms. Leavitt. I believe we have heard enough for now. The court will reconvene tomorrow to proceed with the necessary proceedings. The gavel came down with a firm strike, signaling the end of the session. The defense team was left to regroup, their earlier confidence shattered by the events that had unfolded. They had underestimated Karoline, and now the truth was firmly on her side. As Karoline stepped down from the stand, a sense of relief washed over her. The battle was far from over, but she had won an important victory, one that would resonate beyond the courtroom. She had exposed corruption. She had stood up to those who thought they could silence her. And most importantly, she had ensured that justice would prevail. The courtroom emptied out, but Karoline remained for a moment longer. She stood in the center of the room, taking in everything that had just happened. In this space of power and influence, where people's lives could be controlled by the decisions of one man, she had witnessed the breakdown of that power. Judge Hayes was no longer a symbol of authority. He was a criminal, and that fact was irrefutable. As she left the courthouse, Karoline was greeted by her colleagues, reporters, and even a few people who had witnessed the drama unfold in the courtroom. They all recognized the significance of what had just transpired. Karoline had not only defended herself, she had defended the very principles of justice that the court was meant to uphold. In the days that followed, Judge Hayes was officially charged with corruption, bribery, and several counts of misconduct. His arrest became a national story, and Karoline's role in exposing him was hailed as a victory for transparency and accountability in the judicial system. The case would continue, but the foundation of truth had already been laid. Karoline had faced down a corrupt judge, stood her ground, and ensured that justice was done. In the process, she had not just defended her own integrity, she had reminded everyone that no one, not even the most powerful figures, was above the law. The end of the trial was not the end of Karoline's journey, but it was a monumental moment, a moment when the scales of justice had tipped in her favor and the corrupt had been exposed for all to see.